Hello, my name is Lila Malone, and I'd like to talk to you about the inadequacies of American sex education and how we can fix them. The 4 points I'm going to bring up in this presentation are reasons why the sex education in this country is poor, reasons why proper sex education is all around important, and then I want to bring up some demonstrative examples on how sex education can be improved and what could be talked about that doesn't usually get discussed, and overall how we can fix the issues in American sex education. So one of the first inadequacies is the lack of requirements that the states have. There is no federal mandate for sex education. The graph shows that the states in red are where sex education is mandated, and the states with red lines are where sex education must be medically accurate. So only 22 states in the US mandate sex education, and of those states, only 7 of them require that the information being taught is medically accurate. This is a problem because it allows for spread of misinformation and push of religious values that not all students may have. Another problem is abstinence-only education. This is one of the most common forms of sex education. It does not properly allow students to learn about their bodies or understand their feelings because rule number 1 is to not have sex and nothing else gets discussed. The only important thing that teachers demonstrate is that you do not have sex or you do not have sex before marriage in order to prevent pregnancy that you don't want. This is a problem because kids with their hormones, not kids, teenagers with hormones and going through puberty, they are going to want to have sex, and it is most likely going to happen. With abstinence-only education, they will not be prepared for how to handle the encounters, and they could potentially be unsafe. Like I mentioned before, abstinence-only education is often held in Christian values, and it promotes religious ideas that may not be held by all students, or by those who do not hold any religious values. Abstinence-only education can also encourage rebellion, which could lead to unsafe sex, unwanted pregnancies, STIs, etc. There's also a lot of LGBT discrimination within certain kinds of sex education. I'm going to use specific examples taken from a source that is listed at the end of this presentation. Arizona is not allowed to portray homosexuality in a positive manner, period. They're not allowed to promote a homosexual lifestyle in any kind of way that isn't looked down upon. In Oklahoma, teachers have to say that gay men were responsible for the AIDS epidemic and that AIDS is a gay disease. This is simply not true, and this has been proved by many scientific researchers. And education does not always include LGBT sex education or alternatives to procreative sex. I will go into a little bit more about sex for pleasure later in this presentation. However, not including LGBT sex in sex education is discriminatory because there may be some LGBT teenagers who, while they understand that they are attracted to the same sex or not attracted to the opposite sex, they do not know how to act on those feelings and may not be able to demonstrate their feelings or sexual desires in a safe and positive way. And the discouragement of LGBT relations in sex education, especially in states like Arizona and Oklahoma, is just creating an unsafe environment for teenagers like these. Why is proper sex education so important? It enables bodily autonomy. People will know their bodies better and understand where their boundaries lie. And understanding your body is important in terms of all areas of health. It can prevent sexual assault and unwanted pregnancies. This ties into bodily autonomy because, like I mentioned, it enables the setting of boundaries and understanding when boundaries are being crossed. While it cannot completely prevent sexual assault, because of course horrible things happen, it can encourage especially women who are sexually assaulted the most, but also men, to understand where their boundaries lie and how to properly disclose to their partners what they want and don't want. And yes, it also can prevent unwanted pregnancies because The use of condoms and birth control should be widely taught. And also, yeah, sorry. It establishes a communal understanding. So when students are taught um, proper sex education altogether, you can more properly understand one another and what each other is going through. And also, um, the separation of sexes in some sex education programs, it disables communal understanding because there is an enhanced separation and understanding that men and women are distinctly different and cannot understand one another, which is simply not true. I think it's important for kids to be taught co-ed sex education because it enables a sense of community and there's a more proper understanding between the sexes or between the genders. It can discourage discrimination when LGBT sex education is included. People can learn more about what LGBT plus people do and who they are, and they may understand that if they have homophobic sentiments, to discourage those, or to understand that just because people are different doesn't mean that they are negative. It's also important that in sex education there is a sense of empowerment because you understand what your body is doing, what you want. It also connects to the enabling of bodily autonomy. And it also reduces stigma, both sexual stigma among the sexes, stigma against LGBT people, and stigma around sex in general. So this is my first demonstrated example. I'm sure you've heard the question of, or the stereotype of how men can't find the clitoris. It's unlikely that you know about the CUV complex, which includes the clitoris. When the joke is discussed of men can't find the clitoris, they're talking about the head located here. What many people don't know is that the clitoris, that is just the clitoral head covered by the hood, and there is a whole internal structure that can also be stimulated for pleasure, which is these here. The CUV complex is important to female sexual pleasure. The urethral opening and the urethral sponge specifically are connected to female ejaculation, which a lot of people either don't know about or think is fake. Connected to the Skene's glands near the urethral opening, sometimes when a woman is aroused, a fluid will excrete from there. It is similar to how men can be stimulated via the prostate, and it's a big source of sexual pressure, though not all women experience it. It is still possible. The bulbs here can also be stimulated for sexual pleasure, and there's a whole other part here that can also be stimulated. Though it is slightly more complicated, it is something that is not usually talked about. This whole dichotomy of organs that can come together to make a sexual experience more pleasurable. Another thing that's not often talked about in sex education is misogyny and sexual stigma, specifically surrounding women. Where it's not often discussed that for a long time, and still nowadays, women were viewed as sexual objects, and are still viewed as sexual objects. And there's not really a discouragement of that sentiment enough nowadays. I'm drawing a blank. Forgive me. Women should be taught that their bodies are their own and that they are not for any man to use, which is not often the sentiment given. Though there is sexual stigma surrounding males as well, it is more prominent in females that if a woman goes out and sleeps with a bunch of people, she's considered a slut or whore, and if a man goes out and sleeps with a bunch of people, he's held in high esteem, considered a pimp, or other various language uses. Women need to be taught that just because they have multiple sexual encounters does not make them less than compared to anyone else, which is a sentiment not often shared enough in sex education. We need to teach our teenagers that people deserve respect. All people deserve respect, no matter what their sexual history. So, how can we fix sex education inadequacies. I think it's important that we mandate medically accurate sex education nationwide. Though it may not be possible to mandate sex education nationwide, I think it's important that we try to mandate medically accurate sex education in states that already have it. Because if it is not medically accurate, we are teaching improper things to the students. Include information about sex for pleasure, kink, and LGBT sex within sex education. Sex for pleasure is so important, and it is so often overlooked, especially in sex education. Kink is another demonstration of sex for pleasure, like BDSM, and it is another sense of, it's a communal tie to how people, it's also reducing stigma around kink and understanding that people can experience sexual pleasure in all kinds of different ways and that they shouldn't be looked down upon. LGBT plus sex I discussed previously. Incorporate sexuality education, including asexuality. So it's important, like I said, to include LGBT people in sex education, but it's especially important to include people of asexuality or demisexuality. People like these don't experience sexual attraction like people of allosexuality, anyone who experiences sexual attraction, do. Asexuals do not experience any sexual attraction, while demisexuals experience sexual attraction after romantic attraction. It is important to, while including education about sex for pleasure, understand that not all students may experience sexual desire and make that a note and saying that that is normal and okay. And it's so important to encourage students to ask questions. There's a lot of stigma surrounding sex, like I've mentioned many times, and people often feel awkward talking about sex, especially in a formal setting. So I think encouraging students to ask questions and inquire more about things discussed, or maybe talk about things that weren't discussed with someone who is properly educated, is important to include. These are my sources. Thank you very much for listening.